A German prisoner stood frozen as the American sergeant called roll. Fischer, Hoffman, Weber, Schmidt. The names echoed across the parade ground in perfect English pronunciation, but they were unmistakably German. The prisoner, Hans Bergmann, had prepared himself for foreign names, for the harsh sounds of English surnames he couldn't pronounce. Instead, he heard the names of his childhood neighbors, his school teachers, his distant cousins. For a man raised on Nazi propaganda about racial purity and the singular German folk, it felt like stepping into a fever dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Across U.S. prison camps that summer, more than 371,000 German POWs would confront a truth that shattered every assumption they held. The enemy wasn't just strong in weapons or industry. The enemy was, in part, German, or at least descended from Germans who had crossed the Atlantic generations before. Nazi ideology had promised that America was a mongrel nation, weak because of its mixed population, incapable of true unity or strength. Propaganda films had depicted the United States as a chaotic place where immigrants fought each other constantly, where loyalty was impossible because no one shared blood or heritage. Yet what these men encountered inside the barbed wire contradicted everything. The camp commander's nameplate read, Colonel Friedrich Becker. The medical officer who checked their health bore the name Captain Wilhelm Schneider. Even the kitchen staff included men named Zimmerman, Brown, and Klein. These weren't prisoners. These were their captors, Americans with German blood, speaking English fluently but carrying surnames that could have come from any village in Bavaria or Saxony. For POWs indoctrinated to believe that bloodline determined loyalty, this easy integration seemed impossible. Hans Bergmann wasn't alone in his shock. Each interaction chipped away at the carefully constructed myth. What Nazi ideology had tried to cement over 12 years began to crack in the first weeks of captivity.
In May 1944, though North Africa had fallen the year before, thousands of German and Italian prisoners were still being processed through camps in Tunisia and Algeria before their long voyage to America. Among them was Corporal Klaus Adler from Stuttgart, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who had fought until the bitter end. He expected hardship and hostility. What he didn't expect was to be processed by a U.S. lieutenant named Hermann Vogel, whose name sounded unmistakably German. "Vogel?" Klaus asked in surprise. The lieutenant smiled. "My great-grandfather left Germany in 1848, didn't want to live under the Kaiser." Then he returned to his paperwork. The encounter unsettled Klaus. How could a man with German blood fight against Germany and feel no conflict? Nazi ideology had taught that blood determined destiny. The Germans everywhere were bound to the Reich. Yet here was proof that identity could be chosen. Throughout the North African processing camps, Klaus saw more Americans with German names: Richter, Lang, Hoffman, Bauer, Lehman. One German officer later told the Red Cross, "We were told Americans had no roots, but their roots simply grew elsewhere." For many, Tunisia marked not just military defeat, but the collapse of an illusion that loyalty was born, not chosen.
The Atlantic crossing took 3 weeks aboard converted Liberty ships. For German prisoners like Walter Brenner, a former mechanic from Hamburg, the voyage was a strange mixture of discomfort and surprise. The ships rocked in heavy seas, but what struck Walter wasn't the nausea, it was the crew. On the second day, a sailor approached with extra rations. His name tag read, Petty Officer Ludwig Bauer. Walter stared at it, then at the man's face. Broad features, blue eyes, light brown hair that could belong to any German. "Bauer?" Walter said in German, unable to hide his astonishment. The sailor grinned. "Yep, my folks came from Württemberg, 1923, settled in Milwaukee. Best decision they ever made." He switched easily between German and English, his accent unmistakably American, but his vocabulary clearly learned at home from parents who refused to let the old language die. "You speak German?" Walter asked, still processing the implications. "My parents insisted," Bauer explained casually, "but we're American now, through and through." He said it with unmistakable pride, no hint of shame or conflicted loyalty. For Walter, the conversation was profoundly disorienting. In Germany, emigrants were viewed as deserters who had abandoned the Volk in its hour of need. Yet this man spoke of his parents' emigration as a triumphant success story. More confusing still, he was raised with German culture, spoke the language fluently, yet felt no loyalty whatsoever to Germany itself. The ship's manifest revealed the pattern extended far beyond one sailor. Nearly 20% of the crew carried German surnames: Schmidt, Muller, Wagner, Kohler. These men worked alongside sailors named O'Brien, Kowalski, and Rossi without any apparent hierarchy based on ethnic origin. They were simply Americans, unified by citizenship rather than divided by ancestry. One evening, prisoners gathered on deck for fresh air. A young guard named Heinrich Becker stood watch, relaxed and seemingly unthreatened by the men he guarded. "Becker," one prisoner ventured carefully, "that's a German name." "Sure is," the corporal replied cheerfully. "My grandparents came from Bremen. My grandmother still makes the best Apfelstrudel you've ever tasted." "But you fight against Germany?" another prisoner asked, genuinely confused by what seemed like an impossible contradiction. Becker shrugged with easy confidence. "I fight for America. Germany's where my grandparents came from, but America's where I come from. There's a difference." The simplicity of his answer was profound. For men raised to believe ancestry determined identity absolutely, the idea that someone could acknowledge German heritage while being fully, uncomplicatedly American was revolutionary. It suggested identity was chosen, not inherited through blood. That loyalty was earned by a nation through its actions and ideals, not owed automatically because of ethnic background. By the time the ships approached Norfolk, many prisoners had begun questioning everything they'd been taught about blood, loyalty, and what it meant to belong to a nation. The train journey from Norfolk to the interior camps took prisoners through the heart of America. For men like Johann Kessler, a former teacher from Munich, the trip was an education in geography and identity. The trains were standard passenger cars, with windows that allowed views of the passing countryside. But what struck Johann most wasn't the landscape, it was the station stops. At Richmond, Virginia, the train paused to take on water. A station master named Heinrich Bauer oversaw the operation. His name was painted on a wooden sign outside the office. H. Bauer, station master since 1936. He spoke to the engineer in English, but his surname was unmistakably German. At a small town in West Virginia, the train stopped for a mechanical check. The repair crew included a young man named Ludwig Stein, whose toolbox bore his name in hand-painted letters. He worked efficiently, barely glancing at the prisoners in the windows, just another day's work. In Ohio, the train pulled into a larger station. On the platform, a family waited for a different train. The father wore overalls and held the hand of a small boy. Their luggage was labeled Familie Weber. They spoke English to each other, but the surname told its own story. Johann began to count the German names he saw. Signs on businesses: Schmidt's Hardware, Müller's Bakery, Wagner Auto Repair. Town names with German origins: New Berlin, Hanover, Bremen. Even in casual conversation overheard through open windows, he heard names. Ask Otto, tell Friedrich, the Schmidts are coming for dinner. The prevalence was astonishing. Nazi propaganda had insisted that German emigrants were isolated, marginalized, forgotten. Yet here, German names were everywhere, on storefronts, on mailboxes, on signs welcoming travelers to towns founded by German settlers generations ago. At one stop in Indiana, a guard named Corporal Albrecht Neumann struck up a conversation with Johann through the train window. "You're wondering about all the German names," he said in German. "Yes," Johann admitted.
We were told immigrants lost everything, that they became nothing in America." Neumann laughed. "My great-grandfather came in 1854, founded a farm, raised 10 kids, became a pillar of the community. We've been here 5 generations now. We didn't lose anything. We built something new." "But you still speak German?" Johann asked. "My grandmother insisted we learn," he explained. "She wanted us to remember our roots. But our branches, those are American." He gestured to his uniform. "This is who we are now." The train continued westward, through Illinois, Missouri, Kansas. At each stop the pattern repeated. German surnames on uniforms, on storefronts, on mailboxes. A geography of heritage that had been invisible to prisoners until they arrived in America itself. One prisoner, Wolfgang Adler, kept a makeshift journal on scraps of paper. His entries from the train journey reveal his growing confusion. "Everywhere we go, German names. Bauer, Müller, Schmidt, Weber. These are our names, but these are their people. How can our enemies be us? How can we be fighting ourselves?" The question haunted many prisoners. If Americans with German heritage could be so numerous, so successful, so thoroughly American, then what did it mean to be German? Was it blood? Language? Geography? Or was it something else, something Nazi ideology had tried to define but had gotten fundamentally wrong?
When the trains arrived at Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners stepped onto a platform where guards lined up to receive them. The roll call began immediately, and German names echoed across the grounds. Sergeant Franz Keller, Corporal Emil Hoffman, Private Johannes Meyer. The camp sprawled across flat Kansas prairie, wooden barracks in neat rows, administrative buildings at the center, barbed wire and guard towers surrounding it all. Camp Commander Colonel Friedrich Becker addressed the arrivals from a raised platform. He spoke in English, with the translator repeating his words in German. But even before translation, prisoners noticed his nameplate, his bearing, features that could have belonged to any German officer. "Welcome to Camp Concordia," Becker said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, eat, and be housed adequately. In return, you will follow orders. Is that understood?" The prisoners nodded, processing the strangeness of being addressed by a man named Becker in an American uniform. Guards divided prisoners into groups and assigned barracks. Hans Bergmann found himself in Barrack 7, overseen by Sergeant Otto Frank. Stocky, perhaps 30, with a no-nonsense demeanor. He spoke English primarily, but occasionally used German phrases with a slight Midwestern accent. "Frank?" Hans asked quietly. "That's right. Grandfather came from Frankfurt, hence the name." He said it without embarrassment, just a fact. That first night, as prisoners settled into bunks, conversations turned to the names. "Did you see how many are German?" one whispered. "Becker, Frank, Hoffman, Meyer, like a Munich phone book." "But they don't act German," another replied. "They act completely American." "How can they fight us? Doesn't blood mean anything?" The question hung in darkness. For men raised on Nazi racial theory, German Americans were a paradox. Blood was supposed to determine loyalty, yet here were people with German blood who felt no loyalty to Germany whatsoever. One older prisoner, former schoolteacher Ernst Vogel, finally spoke. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we've been taught wrong. Maybe blood doesn't determine who you are. Maybe it's what you choose that matters." The suggestion was radical, but surrounded by guards named Schmidt and Weber and Müller, it was hard to deny. By the end of the first week, the prisoners had settled into a routine. Morning roll call, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, and free time before lights out. The routine was familiar, almost military in its precision. But the names never stopped being strange.
The mess hall staff included Sergeant Wilhelm Bauer, who managed the kitchen, and Corporal Ernst Zimmermann, who oversaw supplies. The food was adequate, far better than what many prisoners had eaten in North Africa, but it was the servers who drew attention. Private Heinrich Schaefer ladled soup. Private Ludwig Werner distributed bread. Private Karl Fischer poured coffee. During meals, prisoners sat at long tables and ate in silence. But afterward, during the brief social time, conversations inevitably turned to the names. Bauer, Zimmermann, Schaefer, one prisoner muttered. These are farmer names, working names, German names, but they serve American food in American uniforms? A guard overheard and approached. His name tag read Corporal Gustav Hoffman. He spoke in German, his accent American, but his vocabulary clearly learned at home. You're wondering how we can be German and American at the same time? The prisoners nodded. It's simple, Hoffman said. My grandparents brought their heritage, their language, their food, their traditions, but they came here to be American. They didn't want to recreate Germany and Wisconsin. They wanted to build something new. We kept the best of what they brought, family values, work ethic, traditions, but we became American, fully. But don't you feel torn? One prisoner asked. Fighting people who share your blood? Hoffman shook his head. Germany's where my grandparents came from. America's where I come from. There's no conflict. My loyalty is to the country that gave my family a chance, not to the country they left behind. The clarity of his answer was startling. For prisoners raised on blood and soil ideology, the idea that loyalty could be chosen rather than inherited was revolutionary. Yet here was proof, standing in front of them in an American uniform, speaking with confidence about a dual identity that Nazi propaganda said was impossible.
Work assignments began the second week. Prisoners were divided into labor details, some assigned to camp maintenance, others to agricultural work on nearby farms, still others to light manufacturing or food processing. The guards who supervised these details continued the pattern of German surnames. Hans Bergmann found himself assigned to a farm labor detail under the supervision of Sergeant Paul Richter. Richter was perhaps 40 years old, weathered from outdoor work, and he spoke German fluently with a slight accent that suggested Bavarian roots. "Richter?" Hans asked on the first day. "That's right," the sergeant replied. "Family came from near Munich, 1880s. Homesteaded in Nebraska, been here ever since." "Do you know Germany?" Hans asked. "Never been," Richter said. "My grandfather talked about it sometimes, but always has the old country, the past. America's my home, only home I've ever known." The farm work was hard, but not unbearable. Prisoners worked in groups, harvesting wheat, mending fences, tending livestock. During breaks, Sergeant Richter would sometimes share stories about his family's immigration, about the hardships his grandparents faced, about how they built a life from nothing on the American prairie. They didn't leave Germany because they hated it. They left because there was no future there. Too many people, not enough land. America promised opportunity, and it delivered. My grandfather always said coming here was the best decision he ever made. For Hans, hearing emigration described as a positive choice rather than a betrayal was jarring. Nazi propaganda had painted immigrants as cowards or failures, yet Richter described his grandfather with obvious pride, as a man who had made a brave choice and succeeded. Other work details had similar experiences. Wolfgang Adler worked under Corporal Johannes Becker, whose family had emigrated from Saxony in 1905. Klaus Fischer's detail was supervised by Sergeant Friedrich Lehmann, grandson of immigrants from the Rhineland. Johann Kessler found himself working under Lieutenant Ernst Wagner, whose great-grandparents had arrived in America in 1848 as political refugees fleeing the failed revolutions. Each supervisor told a similar story. German heritage preserved in family traditions, language sometimes maintained across generations, but identity firmly American. These men felt no conflict between their ancestry and their nationality. They had simply accepted that people could be both, German in heritage, American in identity and loyalty. The camp library offered another revelation. Prisoners were allowed limited access, and many took advantage to read books in German or English. The librarian was a civilian contractor named Frau Elisabeth Müller, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun and glasses perched on her nose. "Müller?" Hans asked when he first checked out a book. "Yes, dear," she replied in German. "My husband's family came from Hanover. Mine came from Westphalia. We met at a German social club in Kansas City." She stamped his book card with practiced efficiency. "A German social club?" Hans asked, surprised. "Oh, yes," Frau Müller said. "There are dozens of them. German-American societies, Lutheran churches with German services, singing clubs, beer halls. We maintain our heritage, you see. We're proud of where we came from." She paused, then added firmly, "But we're American. No question about that." The library's collection included books in both English and German. Hans noticed volumes by Goethe, Schiller, and Heine, sitting alongside Steinbeck, Hemingway, and Twain. German literature preserved, American literature embraced. The shelves seemed to embody the dual identity Frau Müller had described. Over the weeks, Hans returned often. Frau Müller would sometimes share stories about her family's immigration, about the German communities that had flourished in the Midwest, about how traditions were maintained even as people became fully American. "My grandmother made the same recipes her grandmother made in Germany," Frau Müller explained. "Every Christmas we had Lebkuchen and Stollen, every Sunday Sauerbraten and Rotkohl. But we spoke English at school. We pledged allegiance to the American flag. We followed American customs. We were both, you see, German in heritage, American in heart." The concept of both was difficult for prisoners to grasp. Nazi ideology insisted on singular identity, on blood loyalty, on the impossibility of divided allegiance. Yet here was evidence that people could maintain cultural heritage while adopting national identity completely. They could bake German cookies and sing American anthems without feeling any contradiction. As summer turned to fall, the prisoners began to notice subtler details. The Protestant chaplain at the camp was Reverend Carl Fischer, whose Sunday services occasionally included German hymns alongside English ones. The medical staff included Dr. Heinrich Weber, whose diploma from Johns Hopkins University hung on the wall of the camp infirmary. Even the postal clerk, who distributed letters from home, bore the name Corporal Ludwig Braun. These weren't isolated cases. They represented a demographic reality that Nazi propaganda had obscured. German Americans were everywhere in the U.S. military, in civilian life, in positions of authority and responsibility. And far from being conflicted or marginalized, they seemed perfectly integrated, comfortable in identities that honored heritage while embracing nationality. One evening, Hans struck up a conversation with a guard named Private Ernst Hoffman during mail distribution. Hoffman was young, perhaps 20, with an easy smile and a casual manner. "Hoffman," Hans said, "your family's from Germany." "Grandparents, yeah," the young man replied. "Came over in the 20s after the First War. Things were rough in Germany then. They wanted a better life." "Do you speak German?" Hans asked. "A little," Hoffman admitted. "My grandma taught me some, but mostly we speak English at home. German's just for special occasions, you know. Christmas, Easter, when the old folks get together." "Does it feel strange," Hans pressed, "fighting Germany?" Hoffman considered. "Not really. I mean, I know my grandparents came from there, but that's history. I'm American. Born here, raised here, this is my country. Germany's just where my ancestors came from. Like how some guys' families came from Ireland or Italy or Poland. It's part of who I am, but it doesn't change what I am." The simplicity of his answer belied its profundity. For prisoners conditioned to see blood as destiny, the idea that ancestry was just one ingredient in identity, not the defining factor, was revolutionary. Yet here was a young man who felt no divided loyalty, no confusion, no conflict. He was simply American,
with German heritage as a footnote rather than a definition.
By late autumn, the prisoners had been in American captivity for months. The shock of German names had faded into routine, but the implications continued to resonate. Hans Bergmann found himself lying awake at night processing what he'd learned. If Americans with German blood could fight Germany without hesitation, then blood wasn't destiny. If German heritage could be maintained while adopting American identity completely, then culture wasn't fixed. If people could choose their loyalties rather than inheriting them, then Nazi racial theory was fundamentally wrong. The realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because it meant everything he'd been taught was false. Liberating because it suggested identity was choice, not fate. In the barracks, late-night conversations began to shift. Prisoners still spoke of home, of families, of the war, but increasingly they also spoke of what they'd learned, that America was strong not despite its diversity, but because of it, that German Americans had enriched the country rather than weakening it, that loyalty was earned through opportunity and freedom, not owed because of blood. "I wonder," Ernst Vogel said one night, "if Germany could have been like this, if we had welcomed difference instead of demanding purity, if we had allowed people to bring their heritage while becoming German, if we had built strength through diversity rather than uniformity." It was a dangerous thought, questioning the very foundation of Nazi ideology. But lying in the darkness, guarded by men named Schmidt and Weber and Müller, it was impossible not to think it. The prisoners had arrived expecting to face a foreign enemy. Instead, they had found a nation that included their own heritage, transformed into something new. They had expected blood loyalty and racial division. Instead, they had found chosen loyalty and integrated diversity. As winter approached, the prisoners settled into camp life with new understanding. The war would end eventually, and they would return home changed, carrying knowledge that contradicted Nazi propaganda. They had seen that German heritage and American identity could coexist, that blood didn't determine loyalty, that nations could be built on ideas rather than ancestry. And they had learned it all from hearing their own names, Schmidt, Weber, Müller, Fischer, spoken in English by men in American uniforms who felt no conflict between the heritage they honored and the nation they served.
Winter arrived at Camp Concordia with biting winds sweeping across the Kansas prairie. For German prisoners, December brought an unexpected revelation. The camp announced Christmas celebrations, and volunteers were sought for preparations. What surprised the prisoners wasn't the celebration itself, the Geneva Convention mandated religious observances, but who volunteered to organize it. Sergeant Wilhelm Schneider stepped forward first. He was stocky, mid-30s, weathered. "My family's Lutheran," he explained in German. "We celebrate Christmas the traditional way. Thought you boys might appreciate a taste of home." Within days, the camp transformed. Schneider coordinated with local German-American communities. Donations arrived: evergreen branches, baking supplies, small Christmas trees. Frau Müller from the library organized carol singing, teaching American guards with German surnames the old hymns in their ancestral language. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was decorated with pine boughs, tables arranged in a U-shape, candles carefully monitored. The menu reflected traditional German Christmas fare: roasted pork, red cabbage, potato dumplings, and Stollen that Frau Müller and local German-American women had baked. Hans Bergmann sat overwhelmed by the familiarity. The smells, decorations, hymns, they could have come from any Christmas in his childhood. Yet this was an American prison camp, and the people who made it possible were Americans with German heritage who felt no contradiction in honoring both cultures. Reverend Carl Fischer led a short service in both German and English. His sermon touched on peace,
reconciliation, shared humanity. Many of you, he said in German, are surprised to find your heritage alive here. You thought immigrants lost everything, but culture isn't confined by borders. What we've created here proves you can honor where you came from while building something new where you are. After the service, Schneider approached Hans. My grandmother came from near Heidelberg, he said. She taught me the old songs, the old ways. But she also taught me those traditions belong to us now, not to Germany. We could keep them without owing loyalty to a country she'd left behind. Doesn't it feel like betrayal? Hans asked quietly. Schneider shook his head. My grandmother used to say leaving Germany was the most German thing she ever did. Germans have always been explorers, builders. She didn't betray Germany. She carried it with her and planted it somewhere it could grow without the weight of old conflicts. The celebration continued late into evening. German carols alternated with American Christmas songs. Prisoners and guards shared food, stories, and for a few hours forgot the war. For many prisoners, it was a turning point. They began understanding that culture and nationality were separate things, that heritage could be preserved without demanding political loyalty. January 1945 brought news that the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied forces pushed into Germany from both east and west. In camps, prisoners watched their homeland crumble. But alongside anxiety about loved ones, many found themselves discussing what would come after. A new program began. Educational classes organized by the YMCA and church groups, covering English, American history, and civics. What made them remarkable were the instructors, German Americans who volunteered to teach prisoners about the country that had defeated them. Hans enrolled in American history taught by Professor Edmund Weber, a retired teacher from nearby. Weber was in his 60s, white-haired, speaking both English and German fluently. His family had emigrated in the 1880s, part of a wave of German farmers who settled the Great Plains. Today, Weber began in German, we're going to talk about what it means to be American. He pulled down a map and pointed to various regions. German immigrants settled everywhere. We built farms, towns, breweries, churches, schools. In some towns, German was the primary language until the First World War. We had German-language newspapers, theaters, opera houses. What happened to them? One prisoner asked. World War I, Weber said simply. Anti-German sentiment ran high. People anglicized names, stopped speaking German publicly. It was painful, but it forced a question. Were we German Americans or American Germans? He paused. Most chose American, not because they rejected their heritage, but because America had given them something Germany couldn't: opportunity, freedom, and a chance to be defined by what they chose rather than what they were born into. Over following weeks, Weber traced German immigration. He spoke of political refugees who brought liberal ideals, economic migrants seeking opportunity, and how German immigrants shaped American culture. Kindergartens, gymnasiums, Christmas trees, and even hot dogs had German origins. But the core message remained: these immigrants had chosen America. They kept aspects of their culture but adopted American identity completely. Their children fought in American wars without feeling conflict between heritage and nationality. For prisoners raised on Nazi blood and soil ideology, this was revolutionary. Identity was constructed, not inherited. People could choose loyalties based on values rather than ancestry. A nation could be strong precisely because it welcomed diversity. February brought an unexpected development. The camp administrators announced that prisoners would be allowed to write longer letters home, and that these letters could discuss their experiences in America more freely. Censors would still review the letters, but the restrictions were relaxed. Many prisoners took advantage of this to describe what they'd learned. Wolfgang Adler wrote to his wife in Stuttgart, The strangest thing about this place is the names. Our guards, half of them have German surnames. There's a Sergeant Mueller who speaks perfect German. His grandparents came from Saxony. A Lieutenant Brown whose family came from Bavaria. Even the camp commander is named Becker. They aren't conflicted about it. They're German in heritage, American in everything else. I'm beginning to think we've been wrong about many things. Klaus Fischer wrote to his brother, "You won't believe this, but I'm learning English from a man named Professor Weber. His family came from the Rhineland 60 years ago. He teaches us about American history, about how immigrants built this country. The Americans aren't weak because they're mixed, they're strong because of it. Each group brings something, and it all combines into something new. I don't know what Germany will look like after the war, but I think we need to learn this lesson." Ernst Vogel, the former school teacher, wrote to a colleague, "I've been thinking about what we taught in schools, about racial purity, about blood loyalty, about the Volk. Here I see the opposite. Americans with German blood, Italian blood, Irish blood, Polish blood, all working together, all loyal to one flag. Not because they've forgotten their heritage, but because they've chosen their nationality. Choice, not blood. We had it backward." The letters, when they reached Germany, caused confusion and sometimes alarm. Families wondered if their loved ones had been brainwashed or if the letters were propaganda. But the prisoners knew their words were genuine. They were describing what they saw, what they experienced, what they'd learned in captivity.
March brought warmer weather and expanded work programs. Hans was assigned to a construction crew repairing bridges and roads in rural Kansas. The supervisor was Sergeant Friedrich Lehmann, whose family had emigrated in 1920. During lunch breaks, Lehmann told stories about his family's journey. "My father was a carpenter in Munich," he explained. "After the First War, work dried up. Inflation destroyed savings. He heard America was hiring skilled tradesmen, so he brought us over. I was 8 years old." "Was it hard?" Hans asked. "Terrifying," Lehmann admitted. "We didn't speak English. We had no money. My father worked any construction job he could get. My mother took in laundry. But within 5 years, my father had his own carpentry business. Within 10, he'd bought a house. That couldn't have happened in Germany. The class system was too rigid. Here, if you worked hard, you could rise." "Did you miss Germany?" another prisoner asked. Lehmann considered. "My parents did, sometimes. They missed the familiar foods, the language, their families. But they never regretted coming. They used to say, 'We love Germany, but Germany couldn't feed us. America gave us a chance.' As for me, I barely remember Germany. America's my home." The work crew spent weeks on various projects. Hans observed how American communities functioned. Small towns with German names, New Ulm, Frankfurt, and Berlin dotted the landscape. German Lutheran churches stood alongside Baptist and Methodist churches. German social clubs existed, but their members were undeniably American in outlook and loyalty. One afternoon, the crew worked near a small-town school. During recess, children played outside, German, Irish, Swedish, Polish backgrounds, all speaking English, all American. The school bore the name Lincoln Elementary, honoring an American president, not a German Kaiser. "That's what we're fighting for," Sergeant Lehmann said quietly. "A country where anyone can become American, where heritage is honored but doesn't define you, where loyalty is chosen, not inherited. Your Nazi ideology said blood determines everything. We say choice determines everything. That's the fundamental difference." April brought the news everyone had been anticipating. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Germany had surrendered. In camps across America, German prisoners received the news with mixed emotions: relief that the fighting was over, Anxiety about what would happen to Germany, worry about families in the devastated homeland. At Camp Concordia, the prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the official announcement. Colonel Becker, still bearing his German surname, addressed them in English, with Reverend Fischer translating into German. "The war in Europe is over," Becker said. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You are still prisoners of war, and you will remain in custody until repatriation can be arranged. But the fighting is done." A heavy silence filled the room. Then Becker continued, his tone softer. "I know many of you are worried about your families. The Red Cross will help you get information. We'll do what we can to ensure you can contact loved ones. In the meantime, you'll continue to work, to live according to camp rules, and to wait for the day you can go home." After the announcement, prisoners scattered to process the news privately. Hans walked to the camp perimeter and stood looking out across the prairie. A guard named Private Ernst Hoffman joined him, maintaining a respectful distance. "Strange day," Hoffman said, in German. "Yes, I agree. The war is over, but I don't know what comes next." "Rebuilding," Hoffman said. "That's what comes next. Germany will need to rebuild, physically, economically, morally. It'll be hard." "Why do you care?" Hans asked. "Germany tried to conquer the world. Why would you care what happens to it now?" Hoffman was quiet for a moment. "Because my grandparents came from there. Because I grew up hearing stories about German villages and German traditions. Because even though I'm American, I recognize that Germany is part of my heritage. I can love America and still hope Germany finds a better path forward. Those things aren't contradictory." "Nazi ideology would say they are," Hans observed. "Nazi ideology was wrong about a lot of things," Hoffman replied. "That's why it lost." In May and June, activities at Camp Concordia shifted from security duties to education and re-education. With the war over, the focus turned to rebuilding minds and values. American and international organizations organized courses on democracy, civic responsibility, and post-war reconstruction. Many instructors were German Americans who saw themselves as bridges between two worlds. One such initiative deeply affected the prisoners: lectures by German American scholars who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Among them was Professor Martin Stein, a political scientist who had taught in Berlin until anti-Semitic laws forced him to flee in 1938. Now a respected academic in Illinois, he returned to teach those once influenced by the regime that had driven him out. Addressing the prisoners in fluent German, Stein said, "I left Germany because Nazi ideology left no place for people like me. Jewish by birth, German by culture, liberal by conviction." He spoke passionately about how racism and authoritarianism had destroyed Germany's intellectual spirit and moral strength. Yet he offered hope. Germany can rebuild, but not on the old foundations. It must learn that diversity is strength, that loyalty is chosen, and that freedom creates better outcomes than control. His message left a lasting impression. By summer, a new phase began at Camp Concordia. Prisoners were permitted to form committees to prepare for repatriation and to explore how they might help rebuild Germany. These groups met regularly under the supervision of American advisors, many of whom were German Americans. Hans joined the Reconstruction Planning Committee alongside Ernst Vogel, a former teacher, Wolfgang Adler, once an engineer, and Klaus Fischer, a journalist. Their advisor, Dr. Heinrich Müller, a sociologist whose family had emigrated. In August, shocking news swept through the camp. Atomic bombs had been dropped on Japan, and the Pacific War was ending. For the prisoners, it proved America's immense power, but also raised questions about what would happen to them now that the fighting had ceased. The answer came in September. Repatriation would begin gradually.
Prisoners would return to Germany in stages, with priority given to those with families or useful skills for reconstruction. As departure dates were announced, emotions ran high. The men longed to go home, yet felt a strange attachment to the camp, a place that had unexpectedly taught them about freedom, fairness, and humanity. Hans received his notice in October. He would leave in November. As the day neared, he said goodbye to guards who had once been his enemies but had become unlikely friends. Sergeant Wilhelm Schneider, who had organized the Christmas celebration, shook his hand. "Go home and build something good," he said. Professor Edmund Weber handed Hans a German copy of the American Constitution. Study it, not to copy, but to understand. Even Colonel Becker spoke to the departing men. "You came as enemies," he said. "Leave as men who've learned that the future belongs to those who choose it." November 1945. Hans boarded a transport ship in Norfolk, the same port where he had arrived more than a year earlier. The vessel was packed with men like him, prisoners of war returning home, each carrying invisible scars and lessons that would shape the rest of their lives. During the long Atlantic crossing, Hans often stood on deck, lost in thought. He remembered Sergeant Schneider's Christmas celebration, Professor Weber's lessons on democracy, and Dr. Mueller's vision for a new Germany. He thought, too, of the Americans with German names who had shown him that identity and loyalty need not be in conflict. Others reflected in their own ways. Ernst Vogel, who had kept a journal throughout captivity, wrote, "We came expecting to find a weak, divided enemy. Instead, we found a strong, unified nation built from diversity. We were treated not as monsters, but as men capable of change." When the ship docked in Bremen that December, devastation stretched in every direction. Ruined buildings, hunger, and despair. Yet
The winter of 1945-1946 was harsh in Germany. Food and fuel were scarce, and hope even scarcer. Yet among returning prisoners, a quiet transformation began. They shared what they had learned in America: democracy, diversity, and shared purpose. Ernst Vogel taught critical thinking. Wolfgang Adler promoted efficiency for all. Klaus Fischer wrote about German Americans who had preserved culture through freedom. Their testimonies spread across occupied Germany, inspiring some and alarming others. In regions with deep emigration ties, Bavaria, Saxony, and the Southwest, their words resonated deeply, reconnecting families with old letters and memories. Freedom, they said, was not foreign, it was inherited. By 1946, American occupation policy began reflecting the lessons learned from re-education efforts. Many American officials were themselves of German descent, men like Sergeant Schneider, Lieutenant Brown, and Captain Mueller, embodying how heritage and democracy could coexist. Hans Bergmann worked on adult education programs with Major Karl Richter, a cultural affairs officer whose family had emigrated from Munich. Fluent in German, Richter explained, "Democracy isn't anti-German, it's universal. German Americans kept their traditions while embracing democratic values." Education programs reinforced this message through civics, history, and democracy workshops. Returning prisoners shared first-hand experiences of freedom and equality, showing that German culture could thrive within democracy. In the summer of 1946, refugees and displaced persons began returning to Germany, including German Americans once interned during the war. Among them was Father Johannes Becker, a Lutheran pastor who had witnessed the Nazi regime firsthand. Preaching in Stuttgart, he said, "In America, I learned that strength comes from freedom, not uniformity. The Nazis taught obedience. America taught choice. German Americans proved heritage and identity can coexist." His words inspired hope. Crowds came seeking a new vision of a democratic Germany that valued freedom, diversity, and human dignity. A nation rebuilt not on fear or obedience, but on the power of choice.
By 1947, the transformation was clear. Under Allied supervision, West Germany began drafting the Basic Law, a constitution rooted in lessons learned from defeat and captivity. It emphasized human dignity, democracy, and federalism, drawing on American and British models but shaped for German realities. Many drafters had seen democracy firsthand in American camps or through occupation. They knew Germany's rebirth required more than politics. It demanded a new mindset. The Nazi ideal of blood and soil had to give way to freedom and moral choice. Former POW Heinrich Wagner later wrote, "In America, I saw men named Schmidt and Mueller who were truly American. They taught me that identity isn't inherited, it's chosen." The Basic Law reflected that truth. Citizenship based on values, not blood, government limited by law, and Germany's future tied to Europe and human rights rather than isolation and obedience. The 1950s ushered in the Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's economic miracle. Historians credited the recovery to the Marshall Plan, stable currency, and industrial skill. But returning prisoners pointed to another source: lessons learned in American prison camps. "We saw how American mass production worked," said Wolfgang Adler, now a leading industrialist. "Efficiency, fair treatment of workers, and consumer-driven growth. Americans perfected these ideas. We brought them home." German businesses began adopting American methods: standardized production, merit-based management, and modern retail. Supermarkets emerged, consumer goods flourished, and prosperity soared. German Americans symbolized this blend of cultures, proof that heritage and democracy could create shared success. By the 1960s, West Germany's transformation was complete. The nation had rebuilt itself into a thriving democracy and economic power, guided by lessons first learned in American prison camps. A generation once taught to worship blood and obedience had discovered the strength of choice, freedom, and integration. Hans Bergmann, now a respected educator, reflected in 1965. "When I heard American guards named Fischer, Weber, and Schmidt, I was confused. How could Germans fight Germany? But they weren't Germans, they were Americans with German heritage. That's when I understood identity is choice, not destiny. Heritage is a gift, not a chain." Former prisoner Ernst Vogel, now a professor, echoed this in his memoir. "The existence of German Americans shattered Nazi lies. They proved loyalty is earned through freedom, not inherited through blood." That realization saved Germany. The 1970s and 1980s became decades of reflection and reconciliation. Former prisoners returned to America, visiting the camps where they had once been held and meeting the guards who had watched over them. The reunions were emotional, filled with gratitude, not bitterness. At a 1975 gathering at the former Camp Concordia site, now marked by a memorial, Hans Bergmann met Sergeant Wilhelm Schneider again. The two men embraced warmly. "You changed my life," Hans said in careful English. Schneider smiled. "No, Hans, you changed your own life. I only showed you what was possible." They walked across the open prairie where the camp had once stood, now farmland. "This was a prison," Hans said softly, "but it became a school. I learned more here about freedom than I ever did about obedience." Schneider nodded. "That's America's greatest lesson," he said. "Freedom works better than control. Diversity works better than uniformity. Choice works better than compulsion. You carried that lesson home, and Germany is stronger because of it." By the 1990s, with German reunification, the lessons came full circle. East Germany had experienced Soviet-style communism, another form of authoritarianism. West Germany had built democracy. The contrast was stark, and the choice was clear. Germans chose democracy, chose freedom, chose integration with Europe. Former prisoners were now in their 70s and 80s, but their testimony remained relevant. They spoke to students about what they'd learned in American captivity, about how the simple revelation of German Americans had shattered Nazi ideology more effectively than any formal re-education program. Klaus Fischer,
now a retired journalist, spoke at a 1995 conference on post-war reconstruction. We went to America as prisoners, as enemies. We returned as witnesses to a different way of organizing society. The revelation that Americans with German names could be so thoroughly American, so untroubled by any conflict between heritage and nationality, was revolutionary for us. It showed that the Nazi emphasis on blood loyalty was not just wrong morally, but wrong practically. Nations built on diversity and choice are stronger than nations built on purity and compulsion. Germany learned that lesson, finally. It took defeat, occupation, and the testimony of prisoners to learn it. But we learned. In the 21st century, the story of German POWs discovering German Americans became a brief historical note. But for those who lived it, its meaning endured. Hans Bergmann lived to see his grandchildren in a free, democratic Germany. Before his death in 2003, he reflected, "When I first arrived at Camp Concordia and heard German names spoken in English, I thought the world had gone mad. But I realized something profound. If Germans could be Americans, identity wasn't fixed by blood. Culture was portable. Loyalty came from values, not ancestry. Germany had once sought strength through racial purity. America found it through diversity." The guards with names like Fischer, Weber, and Muller proved that heritage and democracy could coexist. Without firing a shot, they shattered the Nazi illusion of racial destiny, showing that Germans could be American, free, and united by ideals rather than origins. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.